Okay, hello everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining today's webinar, School Time Impacts on Students Walking and Biking to School, hosted by the Minnesota Department of Transportation. My name is Michaela Kranz, and I know we have a lot of different folks on the call today, the Safe Routes to School Network, the Technical Advisory Panel for this research project, and then some other interested individuals. So we are excited to have Dr. Levin, the principal investigator for this research project, and Kelly Corbin, the technical liaison for this project, joining us today. I will be getting us started with a little bit of background on our MnDOT research program. So MnDOT's Office of Research and Innovation manages more than 185 research projects in progress, ranging from local initiatives to pooled fund projects with other states, comprising both basic and applied research. So we're here to help transportation practitioners determine whether new research is needed or if existing studies may solve their needs, recommend the best research methodology for your project, access local and national funding sources, and then manage your project from start to finish. And then sharing a little bit about the Local Road Research Board. It is a city and county run organization that sponsors research and educational initiatives that address local transportation needs. So if you are looking to stay up to date with our research, you can follow us online and subscribe to our newsletters. After today's webinar, we will send out an email with the links to subscribe to those pieces. And now the reason why you are all here today to learn about the school times impact on students walking or biking to school research project. It is wrapping up later this month. If you are interested in receiving the link to the final report once it is available, you can subscribe on the project page and we'll send you an email once that is ready. I would like to acknowledge all of the technical advisory panel members listed on the screen. The principal investigator, Michael Levin, who is presenting today, Kelly Corbin and Sophie Kahlo, the technical liaisons, Chad Koistra, the project coordinator, and then all of the panel members that helped guide this work. Your input is so valuable and we could not do it without you. That tees us up to my last update. We are excited to announce the funding of 27 new research projects selected from a competitive pool of 82 proposals. To see the full list of research projects, you can scan the QR code on the screen. We'll also send a link out after the event. If you are interested in serving as a technical advisory panel member on any of these projects, please reach out. We are still forming our TAPs. And if you're looking to just stay engaged and up to speed on these projects, you can hit subscribe and we'll send you email updates as they become available. So before we get started on the webinar, I will read the Tennyson warning, just letting you know that this session will be recorded for those who can't attend. If your camera is on during this session, the recording may include your image, which is private data under the Minnesota Government Data Practices Act. You are not required to allow MnDOT to use your image, and there are no consequences for declining to do so. To opt out of the recording, just turn off your camera. And I would now like to introduce our presenters. So Michael Levin is an associate professor in the Department of Civil, Environmental, and Geoengineering at the University of Minnesota. He received a BS degree in computer science and a PhD in civil engineering from the University of Texas at Austin. His work has been published in top journals, including Transportation Science, Transportation Research, and IEEE Transactions on Intelligent Transportation Systems. His research focuses on traffic flow and network modeling of connected autonomous vehicles and intelligent transportation systems. We also have Kelly Corbin, who is a Safe Routes to School coordinator. Many of you know her with MnDOT's Office of Transit and Active Transportation. So Kelly is going to get us started with an introduction of the Safe Routes to School program in Minnesota. So I'll hand it over to you, Kelly.
All right. Thank you so much. Let me get my screen shared. Thanks everyone for joining us. Happy to just kind of kick us off and ground us in what the Safe Routes to School program is. At MnDOT, the Safe Routes to School program has been around and been funding work in the state of Minnesota since 2006, have had much of a stronger, robust program since 2009, and are fortunate to be using a mix of state and federal funds to kind of maintain this work over the period of the last 15 years or so. We have a statewide steering committee that helps guide the work along with a strategic plan with a strong equity focus to support this work. And our vision statement is that youth in Minnesota can safely, confidently, and conveniently walk, bike, and roll to and from school and in daily life. And I do just want to call out the daily life is a little unique to Minnesota, but it's a way to support our very wide-ranging state of small towns, rural communities, as well as our more urban and dense communities. So we do some work both with travel to and from school or with building the skills so students can walk and bike after school and build those lifelong skills. The Safe Routes to School program in Minnesota has 6 E's. There are some kind of foundational E's across the country. Minnesota added the 6th E, which is equity, in to 2015. We know that we can't just build it and expect people to use it. We have to build safer infrastructure, educate our students, our neighborhoods, our community members on how to use it safely, and then encourage people to go out there and give it a try, while also doing engagement and evaluation to make sure that we're putting the correct treatments in our communities. And then we have this wraparound approach with equity, making sure that the work that we're doing isn't creating new disparities or further expanding the disparities that are present in our communities related to transportation, health education, or physical activity. What it kind of looked like across the state, we do have an interactive map on our MnDOT website for Safe Routes to School if you want to see where we've put investments for this work, both in non-infrastructure and infrastructure. So that is a screen capture of the work. And then just wanted to highlight how we might be a cold state, we might be a state with small and big communities, but Safe Routes to School can be scaled in different communities. And the map kind of shows that all the way up to the Canadian border there. Safe Routes to School, we do see it in a single school. It might be a citywide approach, it might be a countywide approach, or we have some regions that are really looking at it from this broad region of where schools might be consolidated and there might be multiple cities involved in one school district. And then we have our statewide approach where we're working with our state agency partners for some of the shared goals that we have around safe routes to make this the most impactful, beneficial way that we can advance the opportunity for children to walk and bike safely to the places they need or want to go. We're fortunate that 2 years ago, we were able to get a student travel question into the Minnesota Student Survey to help us gather some data on what's happening at a statewide level. And I just wanted to point this out that, students could mark several here, so it's not just that it is 10% walking to school, there's some combined there, but we're seeing about 15% of students statewide are walking, biking, or rolling to school or from school. And that is a large part of our population. And we also recognize that schools are changing, budgets are getting different. It might be hard to get school bus drivers. And that's kind of where the impetus of this research project came, is that as schools are looking to reconfigure transportation routes to save costs or reconfigure those routes when they might not have been able to find school bus drivers, changing up school start times was one of the approaches they were doing. And we wanted to make sure to understand what those impacts could be before some of our communities took those endeavors. And I just wanted to highlight, we have a parent and caregiver survey that we use with our Safe Routes to School work at individual schools or school districts to better understand what the parent or caregiver needs or concerns are for letting their children walk or bike to school. And I think when we start this work with communities, a lot of times they're focused on, it might be distance, it might be stranger danger, it might be the convenience of driving, but pretty consistently we see these top 4 concerns from parents or caregivers across the state, which is mostly around engineering, safety of intersections and crossings, the amount of traffic, speed of traffic, and then distance can be a concern as well. So the cold Minnesota winters aren't necessarily keeping everyone inside. We can do things with our built environment to make it easier, safer, more convenient for students to walk, bike, and roll to the places they need or want to go. So we do have kind of a general inbox. If you have any questions and want to learn more about the Safe Routes to School program or connect with me after this, I'm happy to chat with anybody. But I'm excited to turn it back over to Michaela and hear more from Dr. Levin about the research project.
Awesome. Thank you, Kelly, for really grounding us in the Safe Routes to School program and providing that background. All right. Dr. Levin, are you here?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome.
Okay, so we're ready for your presentation. If you would like to share your screen, you're welcome to do so. I also have a copy of your slides. Oh, I'm seeing yours. They look,
Can you see my screen now?
yep,
Awesome.
perfect.
Great. So, yeah, thanks for giving me the opportunity to present here. So I was the PI on this project. I'm Mike Levin. I'm an associate professor at the University of Minnesota in civil engineering. And this project kind of came from this effort with Kelly Corbin of trying to answer a question of how do school times affect students walking or biking to school, particularly with the Safe Routes to School program, trying to encourage students to use the active transportation. I think it's a really interesting question because intuitively you would think there would be some impact if we have elementary school children that are aged 6 to 10, so pretty young, many of them still traveling with their parents or being supervised closely by their parents, and we put them in a situation where they have to go to school for like a 7:30 a.m. start time. That means that in December, January, and February, they're going to be traveling to school before sunrise. And that means if they're walking or biking in the dark. And we saw there are issues with crossing busy roads or safety. And of course, those issues are probably likely to be even more important um, in the dark, where there's less visibility for a small child. There's more safety issues around there. And so it's quite intuitive that we might expect that having schools start early um, could reduce walking or biking to school by elementary school children. And that this project sought to answer a question of, is there an effect of, do we see an effect where if we start the schools earlier, do we see less walking or biking? And there are many reasons why we would want to start schools earlier because it's convenient for bus scheduling, it's convenient for other schedules. So this is really trying to say, are we getting a negative impact? And what's really interesting is that after conducting this 2-year research project, the answer is basically we have no evidence that there's a negative impact, which is counterintuitive. I didn't expect that at all. And obviously that's something we want to present the evidence for. So that's kind of the short answer. What I'm going to do is is show the evidence to show you that we've conducted a fairly comprehensive evaluation of the evidence that we could obtain. Um, we also, in the process, obtain some information from parents on what factors they find most important. And so that's something that will be useful to present, which I think lines up with what Kelly Corbin was saying a couple minutes ago. So to start off, we considered that if I just wanted to go to a parent of an elementary school child and I asked them, do you prefer to have your child walking to school after sunrise or before sunrise? They're pretty much probably going to say after sunrise. If you give parents a question like that, like I don't know if many parents who want their young child walking to or biking to school in the dark where there's less visibility, there's more safety issues, right? But that's not the question we're asking. The question is, how much does it affect students' actual travel choices? And so to answer that, we have to consider two things. One is, what are students actually doing? And two is, if we ask the parents, what are the reasons for what they say students are doing? And I did that in two parts. The first part is trying to conduct a revealed preference survey of student travel choices. And the reason I did that is because, again, if we survey parents, which we did as well. But if you ask the parents these questions, you end up with a couple of problems. One is low response rate. The people who respond to this are usually people who have a strong opinion in some way, and that creates bias. What I want to do is look at what people are actually doing. And the best way of doing that is observing people's behavior rather than asking people and waiting for a subset of them to respond. But it's difficult to get good observations of people. I mean, sure, we could sit outside of school and record students and how they got to the school, but you can imagine that's going to take quite a bit of time, and there are a lot of schools possible you visit, a lot of students to record, and different days, and so that's not exactly the nicest or easiest way to do that. So instead what we did was we looked for other sources of data. And one of the sources of data that we looked at was mobile source data, where there are apps that track your phones, and there are, like if you use Google Maps, you're getting some data on where your phone's traveling. There are companies that buy that data and aggregate it, and Streetlight is one of those companies that MnDOT has access to. Now, obviously, I don't expect to see like elementary school children having smartphones, or smartphones are being tracked. But if those children are being driven to school, they're being driven by someone, and most adults are probably like to have a smartphone. So what we were looking at in terms of mobile source data was trying to look for patterns in driving trips to schools, reasoning that if students aren't being driven to school, many of them would be considering walking or biking as an alternative. So in other words, if we see a lot of driving trips to school, we can conclude that probably walking or biking is lower. So we looked at various data from Streetlight. We didn't want to get walking or biking directly because we might not get good data from Streetlight on walking or biking. Streetlight tends to have better data on driving anyways, plus it's more robust against students. Now that does involve the issue of we're capturing both parents driving students to school, and we're also capturing teachers and staff going to school as well. So what we try to do is look at number of driving trips to a school versus enrollment. Now, to get the driving trips, we can't really get the driving trips directly to a school. What we had to do is look at streetlight trips that terminate near the school. Some of the reasons are that a lot of parents aren't necessarily going to drop their child off in the parking lot. They might just drive by the school and drop their child off. So we had to look kind of at Google Maps, look at the images, and try to figure out where students are likely to be dropped off, and then select the road and streetlights to get the number of daily trips to a specific street. Now, Streetlight gives us the option to get the number of trips within a specific time of day period and day of year. So we focused on specific months during the school year, as well as morning trips. So trips to school during the morning that would indicate students being driven to school, or teachers and staff driving to school for work. Looking at this, there are some limitations, of course, which is that sometimes parents drop off students farther away, let them walk a block or two due to traffic, due to convenience. It's hard to capture those. And this is kind of a rough estimate, which is one of the reasons why we wanted to collect multiple data sources and just one of them. So our data collection focused on the 2022 to 2023 school year, 6 a.m. to noon, which should capture most of the trips going to school to drop their children off for various start times. I chose those months for the various reasons. February is kind of our month with late sunrise time, so early school start times would start before sunrise. I didn't want to do January or December because of winter break, and if you switch to November or March, you start ending up with the sunrise times being earlier. April I chose because that's after daylight savings time change, but the weather can still be cold, and I needed that comparison against February for weather-related purposes. And September is kind of a month that's schools, even at 7:30 a.m., they're going to start after sunrise, and the weather's going to be pretty good, so that's good, like, control month. I focused on Minneapolis and St. Paul public schools for both the streetlight and for the state preference survey, which we sent to parents, because they have a lot of schools, and some of those schools start at 7:30 a.m., others start later, like even as late as 9:30 a.m. So it's nice to have comparison within the same school district, because there could be things like busing or staff or other district-specific issues, and so if we keep it within the same district, we try to remove some of the other variables. There are quite a number of schools. Now, I only looked at community schools to avoid the magnet schools, which might have more students living farther away. I
Hi,
also had
Dr.
to remove.
Levin.
Yep.
This is Michaela Kranz jumping in. It looks like with the computer connection, the slides are a little bit blurry.
Okay.
Would you be open to me sharing the slides for you just to see if that can increase the clarity?
Go for it.
Okay.
Okay. Awesome.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. So I had to remove some of the schools because there were a very large number of trips observed. So Como Park, for instance, I think we were capturing trips going to the park and not just to the school. And so it just is not a very good data source. There are a couple other schools that had a very large number of trips. All right, so next slide, please. Yeah, so here's what we looked at. We plotted trips, driving trips versus enrollment, and we looked at schools that started earlier versus later. Kind of use 8:30 as a break point, knowing that students will probably arrive to school earlier than the scheduled start time. And this is what it looks like for September. So we can see a clear pattern with respect to enrollment. And in September, it looks like there are more car trips, or the rate of increase with enrollment is higher for schools that start earlier. Let's go to the next slide, though. So we see the same sort of pattern where for schools starting earlier, the number of car trips increases faster with enrollment than for schools starting later. Various reasons could be caused by, but the interesting thing is comparing the September and February, there's not a whole lot of difference in the number of car trips versus enrollment. And we'll kind of see that going on, but if you go to the next slide. So we have this April as well, and it's kind of the same pattern for all of the slides here. And that's kind of like a good visualization of the results. Now, what's probably useful is trying to look at numbers, right? This is just like a rough visualization of what patterns are we seeing. Of course, we calculated specific numbers, so if you go to the next slide, we'll show more numbers here. So what we did was create a linear regression model. We're trying to predict the number of driving trips to the school, knowing that more driving trips is bad in terms of walking and biking. And our variables that we considered were demographics, like race, ethnicity, enrollment, of course, special ed percentage, because we figure special ed students are more likely to be driven, income, because that might affect part of demographics, whether schools are starting before 8:30 or afterwards, and then which month we see. So these coefficients really tell us a lot of what numerically, if we take a school that starts before 8:30 versus a school that starts afterwards, what do we expect to see in terms of the driving trips? And you can't really get that just by visualizing the data, but by tabulating this linear regression, we can really see this. So the coefficient for before 8:30 is -11. And what that means is that we see fewer driving trips for schools that are starting earlier, which is kind of interesting. That's what we're expecting to see. I see in the chat, someone's asking, what does enrollment mean? Enrollment's like number of students enrolled in the school. So if we have more students, we expect to see more trips going to that school. The other thing we wanted to look at was the month. So February here is the baseline. That's our coefficient of 0. April has a negative, means we're seeing fewer driving trips in April. September has a positive, which means they're seeing more trips in September. So possibly students are switching from driving to other modes during the school year. Next slide, please. Yeah, so we removed the insignificant variables, the ones that after doing the statistical analysis, the p-value, it was quite large. It wasn't really clear, so we removed a lot of those. And we still have a very, um, I kept the before 830 variable because that's one we really cared about, and that's still negative here. So it's not statistically significant. The p-value is 14%. So I usually want to see it less than 5%, or but it kind of gives a good idea of the pattern. We did a few more linear regression analyses just to try to delve into this data further. If you go to the next slide. So what we wanted to do was look at just the schools starting before 8:30 and see if the month of February, which has the latest sunrise times, would be different. All right, so this is driving trips. What we're saying is the month of February is the 0, so that's our base case. In September, we're seeing more driving trips. So in other words, students are being driven to school less in February. And in April, it's slightly higher. So in other words, in February and April, it's probably, I mean, if April is not a statistically significant, neither is September. So I'm not sure there's a huge difference between April and February, but in September, there's a large coefficient. So there's probably, there probably are more driving trips in September. So overall, there's not really much evidence in a revealed preference survey of observing students that they tend to be driven more during the late sunrise months, especially for schools that start earlier. So in other words, there's not really much evidence that students are walking or biking less during February when there's late sunrise versus September or April when the sunrise would be earlier. Next slide, please. So again, here, just removing insignificant variables to kind of focus on what we're caring about. And you can see it doesn't really change the coefficients much. Okay, so next slide, please. Here's a different comparison of schools that start before 8:30 a.m. So looking at February versus April, you can kind of visually see there's not a whole lot of difference. And maybe there's actually more driving trips in April than February, which lines up with the numbers we were seeing before. So in other words, not really much evidence that students are being driven to school more in February with late sunrise. Next slide, please. We looked at this for Minneapolis and St. Paul schools separately, just to see if maybe there's a district-specific effect. Looking at this, before 8:30, here is negative for Minneapolis schools alone. That kind of that indicates again fewer driving trips for the schools with the early start time. So nothing really surprising there. Next slide. And in St. Paul, same sort of effect there as well. Next slide. In terms of the demographics, because since we had the data, we figured we'd do this, and it's in the report too. So the way you got the data was the demographics of the schools on average are publicly reported, and so we can plot car trips versus demographics of the schools given enough data points. Looking at there's some slight trends with race and ethnicity. Go to the next slide. You can see some different trends for different demographics. Next slide, please. Thanks. So here's Hispanic and Asian students. Some different trends there. Nothing that was really recorded as statistically significant in linear regression, but some trends that were observed. Next slide, please. All right, so that's a revealed preference survey. Now, that's just one. There are obviously limitations with the data that we were able to obtain at a reasonable cost here. And so what we want to do is have more robust data, and the best way of doing that is get different data sources, analyze the same question different ways. So the second way of analyzing, probably the more traditional way, which is let's ask parents. And well, so typically I want to know how students are traveling to schools and why, but asking or surveying young children, elementary school children, maybe not the best way to get good responses. So we can survey their parents, and we figure at that age, parents are probably fairly aware of how their child is getting to school. Even if their child's walking by themselves, the parent's probably aware of that at that age. So I contacted all the schools in St. Paul Public Schools and Minneapolis Public Schools, and there's apparently a district-wide process of sending a survey out, and I got approval for St. Paul, I think, but not Minneapolis. So I was only able to survey that district. But then I also reached out to several other districts working with Kelly Corbin, like Richfield. There, there were some other Rochester. There are other school districts that really like this, and we were able to get responses from them. So what I did was I created a survey in partnership with MnDOT, and we sent it to the schools, and the schools emailed it to the parents and asked for responses. It was an online survey, so as we sent the link out, parents could go to the link and fill in the survey. Next slide, please. Um, uh, yeah, so kind of motivation for survey. So let's go to the next slide, actually. So here are the questions that we were asking. The first was, we wanted parents to explain how various factors are, like, what affects their choice on how their child travels to school. And we, instead of just asking parents to write a choice, which could be have various responses, parents might not respond. It would be difficult to aggregate responses, and they might not think of things. So instead, we gave them a list of 11 factors, asked them to rank, which one's most important, which one's least important. And it was basically a drag and drop system on the app, or on the website for the survey link. So here are the factors we asked about. One was safety. So neighborhood crime, crossing a high traffic or busy road to get to school, traveling before sunrise or after sunset, which is, of course, what motivated the study, and child's age. Now, we could have just asked parents directly, how comfortable does traveling before sunrise or after sunset, make you in terms of having a young child walking or biking to school? But again, I expected responses to that to be kind of like, obviously parents would prefer their children were walking during the day. And so I didn't think asking that by itself was really interesting. So instead, I gave them a large number of factors and said, rank the importance, and then we can see how important traveling before sunrise is in term relative to other things. All right, so convenience, parent-guardian travel plans, driving times and vehicle speeds in terms of being driven to school, so could make driving less convenient, carpooling with other students. Next slide. And then comfort, so weather conditions being a factor there, options for walking or biking, being either sidewalks or crosswalks, versus having to bike on the street, distance to school, walking long distances is tiring, and then child's interest in physical activity. So those are questions or the factors we asked parents. Next slide, please. We also asked parents to give some information about the child behavior. How often does a child walk, bike, get driven, take the bus, or something else to school? On average per week, the survey enforced that the answers must add up to 5. So I don't think we got too much bad data here. Next slide. And we asked some demographics, race, ethnicity, gender of child, gender of parent responsible for sending a child to school, household income, number of cars at the household. All right, so now we can get into the data and what we found. So next slide. So we looked at Minneapolis and St. Paul public schools. We had some other public schools. After I got approval from district, I had to reach out to the schools themselves because the schools need to send out survey their parents, and not every school was responsive. But we got a good number of schools. Next slide, please. We also translated this into multiple languages as suggested by MnDOT and the principals, specifically Spanish, Somali, and Hmong, by a professional translation service. So believe that it was accessible to parents who don't speak English. Next slide, please. This also went through IRB approval at UMN, just just to check all the boxes there. Next slide, please. So here are the analyses. Next slide. So we received 436 responses from parents overall, and that's. In terms of how many parents the survey sent to, I think it was definitely in the thousands. So this is not a very high response rate. And that's really just a limitation with these sorts of surveys of people, where a lot of people are too busy to respond. They don't care. For various reasons, they just choose not to respond. And that's why I also wanted to do the streetlight analysis. But 436 responses is definitely a large enough data set that we can look for patterns. We can get statistically significant analyses for this. So it's good. It's good enough for what we want to do. Next slide, please. All right. So here's kind of the important thing. This is parents stating how important various travel factors are to them. And so I have on the left the numbers of which factor they are, because putting all the text on the graph didn't really fit. And on the right, I have the graph. Now, notice the average ranking. So it goes from either 1 to 11, but the nothing had an average that was that high. And also it's important to note that the lowest rankings are the most important. So if you're ranking things from like 1 to 11, the thing you rank number 1, that's the most important. And so when we see something with a low value here, that means it's really important. So we can look at this graph and say, what's most important? Factor 1, factor 2, factor 6, factor 11. Okay, so factor 1, child's age. No surprise there. Factor 2, distance to school. Again, no surprise there. Factor 6, comfortable and safe options for walking and biking, such as crosswalks, bike trails, something that Kelly was mentioning before. What we're trying to answer is the importance of traveling before sunrise or after sunset. You can see it's factor 3, and that was ranked about 5.8-ish, right? So it's not the most important. It's not the least important either. It's kind of in the middle. And that's consistent with what we've been seeing so far. Next slide, please. So these are the other factors, and you can see factor 11 was also quite important. 11 is crossing a high traffic or busy road. So again, something that Kelly was mentioning is that if parents do not like having their children having to cross a busy road to get to school. 9 is kind of important, a little bit more important than the early sunrise, which is weather conditions, including temperature and rain, snow, ice. Some things that weren't important were neighborhood crime or the ability to carpool with other students. So we can see what parents are really caring about here. Next slide, please. So looking at the importance of traveling before sunrise, that was what we wanted to answer. So I want to look at parent responses here. So on the left, I have the importance of traveling before sunrise, that are the responses from everyone overall. And then on the right, I have importance of traveling before sunrise, specifically responded to by parents with students at school starting before 8 a.m. So I asked the parents to say which school their child goes to, and we got the start times from the school names. And so we can look at how do parents respond if their school starts early versus everyone. And the pattern's pretty similar, to be honest. So the graph shows how many people responded 1 through 11, right? So 1 is the highest and most important, 11 is the lowest here. And comparing them, there's not really a huge difference in pattern between parents with students who start at early starts versus everyone. So, it's right. So like we can't really, it doesn't seem that, starting before sunrise has some importance from parents, but it's not the most important thing. So next slide, please. We also looked at the reported frequency of travel modes. So we asked parents to say how often their child uses various modes to travel to school. And we separate them for schools that start late versus schools that start early. So here there's 1, 2, 3, and 4. So 1 is unmotorized, that's the walking or biking. 2 is being driven, 3 is school bus, 4 is other. Obviously 2 is what we are trying to avoid, but 1 is what we want to see to be very high. On average, we saw most students are either being driven or taking the school bus. The number the number of students on average walking or biking was quite low. But if we look at schools with late start times versus early start times, we can pretty clearly see that parents at schools at early start times reported their student walking or biking to school at a higher rate. So not really, it kind of shows more evidence that having an early start time is not limiting walking or biking to school here. Next slide, please. Um, so just to confirm, what we did in the previous slide, it's a nice visualization. It's useful to see the patterns in the data. It's not fully rigorous for comparison. We want to get some numbers. And the best way to get numbers here is we're looking at students choosing between different modes of travel to school. The typical choice of model for that is a logit model, a discrete choice logit model. And the way to create a logit model is to predict the utility for various mode options. And here we care about walking or biking, so we're just looking at the utility of active transportation versus other options. The utility function is some constant baseline plus some various coefficients times the variable that we care about, which could be distance, early start times, etc. And if we look at these coefficients, that will tell us how important the variables are relative to one another. There's, of course, a random epsilon term every person perceives or has a different utility, but if we do a logistic regression, we can fit the data and get the best coefficients to the data that we observe. Next slide, please. Yeah, so using logistic regression, it's some math that you can do in Excel with many coefficients. It does take a little bit of work, but it's also quite standard. So next slide, please. All right, so here are the coefficients we obtained fitting the logit model. Now we did put age as, we separated age for younger grades versus older grades. We have here income, gender, race, ethnicity, so like demographics, you have early school start time, number of cars in a household. Notice here that positive coefficients indicate a higher utility, so a higher probability of using active transportation because you're computing the utility for active transportation. And looking at this, we see that distance has a very large negative coefficient. So that kind of tracks, I mean, that's what we would expect. If you live farther from school, you're much less likely to walk or bike. If we look at early school start times, it has a positive coefficient. So in other words, if the school starts early, you're more, according to parent responses, they're more likely for the students to be walking or biking to school. There are various other coefficients as well, like having more cars, surprisingly, or having higher income, those are associated with more walking or biking to school. It could be more that of an income thing where students from wealthier households are more likely to live close to schools and walk or bike or something like that. So some of them are not fully intuitive, but the ones we care about, I think, early school start times, it's quite clear. And next slide, please. So just to kind of tie up, I think we've done a couple of surveys, and I really have to thank the two undergraduate students who helped me, Jacob Isaac and Justin Nee, who helped me do these analyses. But overall, we have several data sources that we looked at. First was the Reveal Preference Survey, looking at observed travel choices. The second was what did parents say about what was important to them? And for that, we saw that traveling before sunrise was somewhat important, but not the most important. And the third was, what do parents say about how their child gets to school relative to the start times of the school that their child goes to? And I think if we look at all of these different data, we all come to the same conclusion, which is that having an early start time does not seem to have a big effect or maybe any effect on students walking or biking to school. So if you're trying to decide, should we have early school start times because it's convenient for bus scheduling or other reasons, is that going to have a big impact on walking or biking? And I think the answer is pretty conclusively no from this study. So do you have any follow-up or any questions? I wasn't really paying attention to chat totally, so happy to answer your questions that you might have now.
Wonderful. Thank you for that presentation, Dr. Levin. I am seeing one question in the chat from Laura. Would you prefer to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Sure. I guess so. There wasn't a strong correlation, but you did see some evidence that students that were in the earlier start time schools were walking or biking more. I guess I'm just curious to why. And then I guess as a follow-up, like going into this, not knowing what to expect from this session, my main piece that I hear in this work is not as much related to the before or after sunrise or sunset, but more about, as you mentioned, convenience. And so I think, you know, further to this study, the question to me is really more about how do we sync up school start times with parent work times in a way that allows for active transportation for those that aren't comfortable walking without adult supervision. And, you know, in North America, that's a tricky thing because it's not a very affordable place and a lot of dual working parents. We just don't balance these times very well like they do in Denmark. So yeah, I guess just was there any inclination as to why those kids were walking more? And do you see yourself doing any other probing follow-up work to find out other factors that we could look at about or to have an impact on active transportation?
Sure. So there probably are some other factors. I mean, the factors that the parents say were most important were really related to infrastructure options like sidewalks or bike trails or the ability to go to school without crossing a busy road. Those were most important by parents. Um, so it's a little, at least the project that I was doing for MnDOT didn't really focus on those factors, and so there's definitely room for follow up to try to examine that more. So I have the data set, for instance, which looks at students or stated travel behavior by school. We have the parents stating the reasons for travel, which again tabulated by for different schools, and we have the real preference data from Streetlight, which again for specific schools. So it might be possible to look at the infrastructure around the school and try to see if there are some patterns there, or maybe some things with start times. But overall, I don't have any specific plans to do that right now, but it's definitely something I could do. And that's really kind of a question with MnDOT. I'd be happy to keep working with Safe Routes to School program or coordinators. In terms of convenience, that it wasn't one of the things that the parents listed as most important. So it's hard for me to comment on whether that was like convenient for parent schedules or some other reason. It just that wasn't what parents stated as what they cared about.
Great question. Kelly, do you have any follow-up thoughts to that?
Sure, I can add a little bit. So we did narrow in this focus for this research project as we were getting a lot of questions from school districts across the state on this issue. And so we wanted to do some research to provide a data driven decision or allow, more complete information for schools and our partners to make those decisions. So while it might not be consistent with each individual school or family's experience, it gives us something. To your comment about like digging into some of these other issues, I think that's where our more localized Safe Routes to School planning assistance is really helpful, where we do, really specific engagement with the school community and neighborhoods to look at that. talking about convenience for one family might make sense when they're going to shift work at a certain time versus another family convenience is they work from home. And so they have more flexible schedule, and that's really going to vary school by school. So we can do some state level data, but to really dig into those mode shift changes, it's best to do that at kind of a school by school or school district level to understand those nuances in that community. But Laura, I'm totally open to ideas that you have of other ways we could provide some data collection that would inform these decisions at like a statewide level. So please reach out and we can chat more.
Okay, any other questions? I'm not seeing any others in the chat box yet. Okay, you have a few more moments. Feel free to raise your hand, go in the chat box, come off mute. On Janine.
Okay, most people call me Minnie, but what is the purpose of what you're looking for here? Do you want to be able to make routes safer for kids? Do you want to find out where the kids are walking? Do you want to find out what distances they're traveling? What was the purpose for this particular study?
Maybe I can take that one. So the Safe Routes to School program is about making the infrastructure safer and reducing crashes, reducing congestion, so that students who are close enough or have the ability level can walk or bike. So that's the program's focus, is really looking at that mode shift and making it safer, easier, more convenient for students to walk and bike at a statewide level across all 350 some school districts in our state. This particular project was looking at a common question we have as schools are reimagining their transportation plans under dwindling budgets and looking at, should we shift high school to be later and elementary schools to be earlier? One consideration of many that they were taking is kind of looking at the school academic standards and those very necessary pieces. We wanted to also provide another perspective on school transportation. So we don't want one policy to be really beneficial, but then negatively impact students in another way, or what might be perceived as a budget change that would be positive that actually is going to create some other concerns later on. So it was some guidance that we can provide to those schools that are examining changing their school start times and how that would impact their walkers or bikers, or if they need to consider 100% busing under those circumstances.
I do have a little bit of follow-up, and that is, did you do anything? Everything was in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Did you do anything in rural or outstate areas where the distances are a lot farther? And I mean, I live way out west suburbs, and there's people that took snowmobiles to school, and that I know that's not the same purpose that you guys are doing here, but did you look at other modes like that?
Yeah, I mean, I just dropped our visualizing tool into the chat. If you'd like to take a look, that shows where we've done Safe Routes to School planning or where we've provided funds for schools to make it easier for kids to walk and bike. And so you'll see that there is a good mix of, you know, all 87 counties are doing something related to safe routes. I think your question is specifically about this research project. This was, I think, the best way to get the data collection and research under the scope of work that we had, the time frame that we had, and give some of that high level information. It's certainly something that when we're doing local planning efforts that maybe a school can take into consideration and do maybe something similar to what Dr. Livin did, or maybe a scaled back approach for those communities to do now that we have kind of a methodology and process. So we have some guidance for schools and our partners to take a look at. We have a process they could examine, and we can support them in looking into that more.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question, really getting to the big picture of why are we doing this work? What are we doing this research for? What are we hoping to learn? So thank you for asking that question. We have a couple minutes left on the call. Anything else that, oh, I'm seeing Blake's hand is up.
Yeah, hello. Thanks for putting this on, doing the research. I've been riding my bike well over a year, every single day of the year. And I see a lot of things we can do better out there with our infrastructure. And one of the things might be bike lockers. Have you looked at those at the schools where they could maybe store their bikes safely and anything like that?
Yeah, we do provide annual grant funding in the fall for non-infrastructure work, which is oftentimes things like bike parking or new crossing guard or student safety patrol supplies and a myriad of other things. Schools tend to lean closer towards the more traditional bike racks out of kind of like a space issue, having it easy for kids to use, not we don't see all kids bike every single day. They might get dropped off because there is a dentist appointment or different kids might be coming and going. So assigning a bike locker to one kid might be a little tricky. Also, when we've had some school partners look into that, they can be significantly more costly than our traditional bike racks. So just looking at being, cost effective, we don't see them that much. I do know some schools, however, are looking at them not for the student population, but for the growing bike commuter population at a staff level. So I'm excited to see how that kind of evolves over time. The blend we do see is more schools where there is bike parking are looking at adding coverage over it so that whether it rains or snows, those bikes can stay a little bit drier. And it's fun because we see innovative approaches to that bike covering. It might be students who build it. It might be an Eagle Scouts project to kind of build some sort of covering to protect those bikes. So innovation all around when it comes to our school partners.
Excellent. Thank you.
And congrats on your over year of biking, Blake. That's awesome.
Yeah, I could fill you in on a lot of challenges I run into, but good to see the research. Thank you.
Mhm. Okay, any final thoughts from Kelly, Dr. Levin, Sophie, or Chad before we wrap up? Okay, thank you so much for joining today to learn more about this research project. Kelly put in the chat her contact information if you'd like to chat more about MnDOT's Safe Routes to School program. I also added in the chat box the link to this research project specifically. The project is finishing up later this month, and if you subscribe on the project page, we will email you that final report and research summary once it is available. And we'll do a follow-up email with all the links and resources that we mentioned today. But thank you so much for your time, and Dr. Levin for walking us through your research, and to Kelly for sharing why MnDOT is doing this and how we're hoping to make things safer and more accessible for students throughout the state. Okay. Be well. Thank you, everyone.